Chapter 6. A Mean Crab. "Holly, get out of the way!" Pete shouted, as he saw the log hurtling down the sand dune toward his sister. But Holly did not understand what he was talking about, so Pete raced to her side and flung himself toward her. He pushed Holly onto the sand just as the log rolled past them. It had missed the girl by inches. "Oh," she gasped, sitting up. "How lucky for me you looked over here, Pete." And she hugged her big brother thankfully. By this time, Rachel and Pam had run over to them. As they all glanced up the steep side of the dune from where the log had come, Pete declared, "That just didn't start down by itself." "You mean," Pam began, her eyes growing wide. "Yes, somebody pushed it off the top of the dune," her brother finished. "Let's find out who did it," Rachel suggested. The children had to dig in with their hands as well as their feet to climb the dune. Finally, they reached the grassy top and looked about them. No one was in sight. Suddenly, Pam shouted, "I see someone! Over there!" She pointed, and the children saw a boy's figure in the distance between the scrub pines that fringed the beach. He was running as fast as he could and soon disappeared. "I'm sure I know who that is," Rachel said. "Homer Roughly." "Does he live around here?" asked Pete. "Not exactly," Rachel answered. She explained that Homer was the son of the head of the treasure hunting party. "He's about 13 years old and can be very mean," Rachel went on. "Just the other day he dumped some small children in the waves." The Hollisters asked about Mr. Roughly's party, and Rachel said the treasure hunters sent their diver down from the barge every day, looking for the old pirate ship, the Mystery. "Mr. Roughly isn't liked any better than his son," Rachel said, "because he's always bragging about how he's going to find the treasure before any of the local people do." "We'll have to watch out for Homer and his father," Pam said. As the three Hollister children and their newfound friend walked back up the beach, Pam asked Rachel if she knew where Mrs. Alton lived. "Why," replied the girl in a surprised voice, "I'm staying with her for the summer." "You are?" It was Pam's turn to be surprised. "Then she's your grandmother." "Yes," Rachel replied, smiling. On hearing this, Holly was the first to blurt out, "Oh, we have a wonderful treasure for her." As Rachel looked at Holly, astonished, and the other children nodded vigorously. Pete then explained why they must see Grandma Alton at once. When he had told about finding the emerald, Rachel's eyes glowed with delight. "Follow me," she urged. "We'll go to Grandma's right now." The children quickly put their shoes back on and ran after Rachel along a path that wound through a valley in the dunes. Soon they were in the center of the small town of Seagull Beach. It was a quaint place, with little white cottages and neat yards. Presently they came to a narrow street. Rachel turned in and stopped before a simple but trim cottage. As the children went up the walk, a sweet-faced woman with gray hair came to the door. "Why, Rachel," she said, looking very pleased, "I see you've found some new friends." "Indeed I have," Rachel replied, and introduced the Hollisters to Mrs. Alton. "You may call me Grandma," the woman said. She invited them into her living room. When they had sat down in the big, old-fashioned chairs, Rachel announced, "Grandma, my friends have some exciting news for you." "Really? I should love to hear what it is." Holly started telling about the lighthouse lamp their mother had received from Uncle Russ. "And when it broke," Pam put in, "we found a treasure in it." At this point, Pete continued, "Yes, there was a real emerald in the clay, and the jeweler says it's worth about $500. Grandma Alden's eyes sparkled with amazement and pleasure as she listened, but now she looked a little quizzical. "Well, my dears," said the old lady, "the emerald must have been in the clay when I used it to make the lighthouse. I suppose you might say it belongs to me, although I really didn't lose it. When Pete and the other Hollisters insisted that she should have the gem, Grandma Alden arose and said, "I'd be very happy to talk this over with your mother. Why don't you bring her over here after lunch?" The children agreed to this. Saying goodbye to Mrs. Alden, they started back. Rachel walked with her new friends to the beach. She said she would go with them part of the way to Uncle Russ's house. As they strolled along the sand, the Hollisters poked at the strange objects cast up by the waves. "What is this funny thing with the long tail?" Holly asked Rachel. "That's the shell of a horseshoe crab," the girl replied, taking a stick and turning it over. Pete picked up a starfish, and Pam found several beautiful small shells. Rachel told her they were the shells of baby scallops, and that many people painted them as souvenirs. "What are those high rocks up ahead there, Rachel?" Holly asked, pointing to a line of glistening boulders which extended far out into the waves. "That's called a jetty," Rachel explained. "It keeps the sea from washing the shore away." The Hollister children raced ahead to examine the jetty. The huge rocks were piled about 5 feet high, and as the waves broke against them, they sent up tall plumes of spray. The surface of the rocks was slippery and covered with moss. "Be careful when you climb them," Rachel warned Holly, who was already scrambling to the top of the jetty. "I will," Holly replied. She shaded her eyes from the sun and looked up and down the beach. "Somebody's running toward us. Oh, it's Ricky." In a couple of minutes, the freckle-nosed boy raced up to them. After Pam introduced him to Rachel, Ricky said, "I want to get something alive to take home." "How about a crab for a pet?" Pam teased. "No," her brother said. "Would you like some periwinkles?" Rachel suggested. "What are they?" "I'll show you," said Rachel, and led him to the foot of the jetty. She pointed to little round black objects clustered on the side of one of the rocks. "They're holding on to the rocks by 1 foot," Ricky cried, bending so close his nose almost touched the tiny shelled creatures. "That's the only foot it has," Rachel laughed. "I'm going to take some of these home," Ricky announced, looking around for a container. Not far away on the beach was a red and blue jar, which somebody apparently had left there after a picnic. Ricky half filled it with seawater, then plucked 10 periwinkles from the rock and dropped them into the jar. "Put a little stone in, too," Rachel advised, "so the periwinkles will have something to hold on to." Ricky found 3 large pebbles and added them to the jar. At this moment, Pam happened to glance down at the sand. She gasped, and the next moment she let out a shriek. A big crab was only an inch away from her toe. Its pincers were open, and as she moved, they caught the edge of it. "Let go!" Pam cried, waving her foot in the air. She expected that any second he would reach her toes. Quick as a flash, Rachel grabbed the crab by the back with one hand and snapped the claw with her free fingers until he loosened his hold. "The horrible creature," said Pam. "Thanks a million, Rachel." "Glad I could help," the other girl laughed. Then she said she must go home for lunch. The Hollisters waved goodbye and set off for Uncle Russ's house. When they told their mother what Grandma Alden had said, Mrs. Hollister promised to go back with the children as soon as they had finished eating. Grandma Alden came out to meet them as they walked up the path to her little cottage some time later. After introductions were made, they all sat down, and Mrs. Hollister opened her purse. She drew out the white box containing the emerald and handed it to Grandma Alden. "I agree with my children," she said, smiling, "that you should have this." Grandma Alden took the lid off the box. For a moment she gazed at the lovely green stone. Then she said, "I have a secret to tell you all. I believe this emerald is part of the pirate treasure, which was lost on the Mystery." Everyone stared in amazement. "Pirate treasure?" the children repeated excitedly. Yes, Grandma Alden said, nodding her head emphatically. Every once in a while, a gem is found on the beach. Did you ever see a pirate? Sue asked, her eyes wide with amazement. Holly swung her pigtails excitedly as she said, "They're real bad men with swords, and they make poor innocent people walk the plank. We know because we had a play in our backyard." Ricky spoke up quickly. Yes, he agreed, and if the pirates who lost the emerald were as bad as Joey Brill, they were terrible mean pirates. Grandma Alden looked smilingly from child to child as they poured out their story about the play they'd given in Shoreham. Then their mother said, "Please don't interrupt. Mrs. Alden was about to tell you of the pirate treasure here at Seagull Beach." The children listened excitedly as Grandma Alden related how other valuable gems had been found on the nearby beach. "Yikes!" exclaimed Ricky, bouncing up and down in his chair. "Then the wrecked ship really must be near here." "It does seem like good proof," declared Grandma Alden. "There must be other gems where this one was found," Pete reasoned. "If we look around where this came from, maybe we can find some more." "Now that's a bright idea," Grandma Alden nodded approvingly. "Will you please show us where you got the clay?" Ricky asked impatiently. "I don't know the exact spot," the elderly woman replied. "I'll have to get in touch with Scowbanger. He brought the clay to me." Scowbanger? What a strange name. The Hollister children looked at Rachel's grandmother questioningly. "Grandma Alden," Holly asked, twirling one of her pigtails, "who is Scowbanger?"